we live on a blue planet, right? And as we think about sustainability, as we think about things like carbon, as we think about, the living biodiversity of this planet, we also have to think about water as one of the fundamental materials that make up the surface of this planet. In the United States, of course, right at this moment, or in the past year, we've had many different areas deal with droughts and floods. We've had both of those. We've also had communities in several areas either suffer from the lack of access to clean water, such as in Flint, Michigan, or afraid that their water security is going to be taken away, as with the Dakota Access Pipeline. So water has definitely been top of mind for environmentalists and for advocates around climate change. The building sector in particular, of course, as Jerry mentioned at the start of this panel, accounts for about 12% of all the water consumed in the United States. So, how can we look at water through all the ways that it applies to sustainable practice, both in terms of big water, that is, resilience, sea level rise, things like that, as well as social use of water, right? Equity. How can we use resource equity to drive better outcomes for the planet? To help us answer some of those tough questions, we have an amazing group of panelists. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for today's program, Armstrong Ceiling and Wall Solutions, as well as Target, and the International Living Future Institute, with whom we have partnered to produce this program, as well as the Net Zero Conference for their support as well. With me on the panel today are Tena Florian, who's the partner at Lake Plato, Pauline Souza, who's the principal and director of sustainability at WRNS Studio, Roxanne Spears, who's the vice president of sustainability for Target North America, and Kristen Dotson, who is the sustainability services director for the Miller Hull Partnership. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Tena, I'd like to start with you. Water has been an important element in many recent Lake Plato projects. Lake Plato, of course, based out of San Antonio, Texas. You've worked on the new Central Library for Austin, Pearl District in San Antonio. And all of those projects have had a significant element of water management. Are there any special considerations for a sustainable architecture design project when water happens to be a big element, even on the site itself that you're working with?
Yeah, I think that the key really, I think water can be a big element in any project, no matter where it's sited. And the key is early in the process, talking about water. We like to start with the assumption that every project can be net zero water and understand what a water balance on any project looks like. We do that through our integrated design charrette process, where we brainstorm with engineers, the client group, super important, landscape architects, and other key consultants to understand really what the conservation opportunities are and collection opportunities, and understand the demand early on in the project. And that really puts you in a good place to create a water story for a project. And obviously when that water story is adjacent to a waterway and has to do with watershed protection or some existing infrastructure that it's using, like at the Austin Central Library, then it becomes this larger district-wide story. And whenever we have projects that the water story of one particular project can be incredible and super important, but when it can really become a district-wide story or a watershed-wide story, then the impact of any one project really is larger and can help with water conservation in any community. So those are the opportunities we look for in our projects, and look forward to discussing this more with the panel.
Absolutely. I mean, I love that statement that you started with, assuming that any project can be net zero water. And then also, of course, echoing what Lisa said in her presentation, right? So when a site has access to a shared water resource, such as a waterway, or, all sites are on shared water resources too, in a way, but a visible water resource, I guess, then it becomes an opportunity for a much larger conversation. That's the other thing about water, of course, is that, unlike energy or carbon, water use is visible and is tangible in some ways. And water equity can be really tangible as well. And I'd love to delve at some point during this conversation about, how we can kind of leverage that as we work with different stakeholders. Kristen, I'd love to bring you in next. The Candida building, congratulations on that, of course, which your firm designed, used water management as one of many strategies to achieve its Living Building Challenge certification. So when you're looking for, really high level sustainability certification like that, of course, most certifications, as Lisa pointed out, the water petal is a big part of the Living Building Challenge, and there's a certain, basic requirement in order to meet certification. But the interesting thing about Candida is that the water systems were used as, to leverage advantages in other building systems as well. And so can we just talk about, what are some of those beyond the normal strategies for water that could help projects become, highly sustainable?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that. I should say too, we need to share credit with Lord X Sargent. They are our local design architects in Atlanta too. So we can't take all the credit. They're great partners. What's been really interesting for us in our Living Building Challenge work is that what we've discovered is the strategies we're using to meet the net positive water petal are transferable to any project, just like Tenna was saying. You don't have to have a living building project to do these things. And that's what we're starting to explore in our portfolio, is how we can bring these technologies into other projects. Maybe not getting all the way to net positive, but still reducing our reliance on these very fragile water systems, water supply systems that we need. So specifically to the Candida building, we harvested rainwater off the roof. As I think it was said earlier, Atlanta gets about 50 inches of rainfall annually, which is actually more than Seattle. So everyone thinks Seattle is the rainiest place. It's not. The difference is we get a little bit of rain like every single day, except in the summer, versus Atlanta gets really heavy storms less frequently. But they get overall more water. So there's free water falling from the sky. Historically, our way of dealing with that in the architecture industry is to move that water as quickly as possible off the building and shuttle it into storm drains, which has led to a host of problems because our stormwater infrastructure in most big cities in this country is over 100 years old. Atlanta specifically was built in the late 18 and early 1900s and was renovated in the 1950s. So Atlanta's water infrastructure is way beyond its useful lifespan. So relying on those systems is already problematic. And despite having all of this rain from the sky, Atlanta can't access groundwater because of the bedrock situation where it's located. It can't tap into groundwater like wells and aquifers and things like that. So really, thank God there's a lot of water falling from the sky, because that's kind of all we have in Atlanta. So the building had to take advantage of that for a number of reasons. And thank gosh, everyone agreed that that was a good idea. So harvesting rainwater off our 18,000 square foot roof, all we needed was actually a 50,000 gallon cistern in the basement. So, people talk about, oh God, the cistern is going to be huge. It's going to take up a lot of space. 50,000 gallons isn't actually that big to meet all of your water needs on a project of this scale. And that's just because, again, Atlanta's consistent, nice rainfall throughout the year. And that water is used for the whole building for potable purposes. It's mildly treated, it gets filtered and then treated with UV light, so it's safe to drink. So it's used, and then that gray water is recycled into the landscape. So we're not using any potable water to water our landscapes. And then it recharges back into the ecology of the site. So it's right next to what's called an eco commons on the campus, which is a beautiful landscaped area, trying to bring in a lot of native and adapted plants, make a beautiful amenity for the campus, for the students, for the faculty, but also for the ecology. However, this one went above and beyond that, as you were hinting at, Avi. The storm water, so we've got all this water falling on the roof. We actually use about 50% of it for the building's needs to be net positive water. That's how much rain is falling on this building. So we were able to use the other percent within the building systems itself. So it's actually part of the heating and cooling system and the HVAC system, because we don't think about it often. When we think about water use in buildings, we're often thinking toilets, showers, drinking water. We don't remember, oh, cooling, right? We have a really high cooling demand in Atlanta because it's very hot there. And our cooling systems typically need some water, or they're forming water through condensate. So that water cycle is part of the energy cycle as well of our buildings. And so this building really took advantage of that to use that excess stormwater as part of the radiant heating and cooling system. Which is a bit different from some of our other projects, but very exciting to have that integrated. And you can only do that when you've got the whole team together very early in the process. You're vetting those options very early with the client, with the contractor, with your designers, with your sub-consultants, if you can even have them on board early enough, because you need everyone at the table to understand how is it feasible? Is it going to work? What are going to be the obstacles we need to get ahead of? Like Lisa pointed out, permitting. What's your local government constraints? You've got to get ahead of that early. And if you give yourself enough time, almost always you can actually talk them into it. Even when those books are, even those laws are on the books, if you give yourself enough time to talk to all the people you need to talk to, you very frequently can create the change that way. So don't assume just because it's illegal now, it'll be illegal by the time your building's actually getting built if you do your work.
Yeah, I think that Lisa's talk really pointed out to how code change can be such a powerful tool, and thanks for reiterating that. And of course, the idea that water systems are not some independent system within a building. It's not just plumbing. It's not just irrigation. It's not just all of those things, but that they might have other uses. And I think that was such a great insight for that project right at the outset of the project. Thanks so much, Kristen, for sharing that with us. Just a reminder to everyone who's attending. As you know, we are taking questions throughout today's session. Please use the Q&A tab to get questions into the panelists. We're also using upvoting today, which means that if you go in there and you see a question that you want answered, please hit the thumbs up sign below the question. Questions that get the most votes will get asked first. We are not using the chat section for questions today. However, keep an eye on the chat window because my colleagues are putting in some of the references and some of the documents and articles that panelists are sharing as they speak. I'd like to come to Roxanne next. Roxanne, Target, of course, you've made a large commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, one of the biggest commitments that we can make in sustainability today. But also, you have this interesting motto of, doing good together. And I think that was a really well-considered sort of position on both the ecological and social aspects of the fight against climate change. How do you approach a resource-sensitive subject like water as part of that broader vision? And also, as part of a manufacturer who uses water in a material way as part of your business?
Thank you. It's a great question. At Target, our approach to sustainability has been very holistic, which is why the UN Sustainability Development Goals were so important to us. At Target, we focus on 7 specific goals, though we impact many of them. We were the only flooring manufacturer actually to sign as a signatory when the Global Climate Compact was first introduced in 2010. And we report all of our actions and commitments to the UN every year. So the UN Global Compact principles are really the how to be a responsible business should operate, while the SDGs are what they can do to operate in a sustainable development format. So we really believe that we need to be committed to those goals to have effective change. And working with the UN Sustainability Development Goals really follows our circular economy business model and the cradle-to-cradle principles for our product design process. Water, also part of the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which is its number 6, should be a concern for all of us. Water is a quickly depleting resource. It's not readily available to everyone. And as well as many cities are dealing with the contaminated water, for Target, we continue to evaluate our facilities for better environmental performance, which includes our water usage. For instance, we did a review of one of our facilities in Dalton, Georgia, and we made one simple change in our dye process. This enabled us to reduce our water usage by 86% in less than 2 years. So for us, doing these evaluations on a continuous basis is really important because we can always make improvements. We also operate our facilities with a closed loop water system to reduce water waste. And because we follow the cradle to cradle design principles, And we have had 98% of our raw materials evaluated by a third party. We know that any water we release will not cause harm to the environment. Again, we really have to take the full approach. It's what we use, it's what we disperse, it's everything. Our resources worldwide are so finite. We really have to be respectful of that for all of us. While substantial progress has really been made in increasing access to clean drinking water and sanitation, billions of people, mostly in rural areas, still lack these basic services. So worldwide, 1 in 3 people do not have access to safe drinking water. 2 out of 5 people do not have a basic hand washing facility with soap and water. And according to the World Health Organization, as we've all been hearing over the last few months, hand washing is one of the most effective actions you can take to reduce the spread of pathogens and prevent infections, including the COVID virus. So it really shows equity does play a role in how our resources are available. And we have to be conscious of that. If we look at the effect climate change has had on water, we see more areas having flooding issues while other areas have drought. Water runoff can cause contamination for waterways, creating concern for what is discharged into our water system. And for Tarkett, we also look at who we partner with. So we've taken another approach, is in our concern for water availability. Tarkett has partnered with a program called Fill It Forward. It's an organization that funds clean water projects. So Tarkett funds clean water projects through this organization. We have what's called a water tag that we send to customers. They scan the tag every time they use a refillable bottle. For each scan, we then donate to a water project. With our customers scanning the tags, we were actually able to fund our first clean water project in New Mexico within 3 days. So these types of partnerships with our customers and organizations really help us have an even larger impact on the environment and people's health. I really believe every action we take as individuals and as manufacturers have ramifications, and not just one. So that's why for Tarkett, we like to maintain our holistic approach to sustainability, looking internally at what actions we can take to have a positive impact, but also what partnerships can we have to make even a larger impact on the health of the planet and people.
Thanks so much, Roxanne. That's really impressive. And I think, you know, it's really interesting because it almost makes one think about, you know, a water equivalent to what we've sort of started to become conversant with carbon today, which is, you know, Kristen and Tana, and to some extent, Lisa, you know, we're talking about water that's connected to the site, on the site, in operation, in use on the site, you know, sort of like you could say operational water, right? But there is also water for every project that's implicated in the manufacturing, you know, like the sort that Tarkett does. So in a sense, almost, you know, upfront water for projects. And even though, as Pauline is going to, I'm sure, tell us in a little bit, you know, there's a deep connection between water and energy, and we can't, you know, ignore that. I think we need to be more sensitive to, as architects and interior designers, to, you know, the water that's sort of implicit in the manufacturing processes, and, you know, how our manufacturing partners like Tarkett are really making strides in terms of working with water. So thank you so much for that, Roxanne. I think that was a really great deep dive into everything that somebody in manufacturing could possibly do, you know, from incentives to savings to, you know, really thinking about resource management on every stage of the supply chain. I'm going to bring Pauline in just a second, but, you know, just as a reminder to everyone, we're here talking about working with water. With me are Tana Florian from Lake Plato, Kristen Dodson from the Miller Hall Partnership, Roxanne Spears from Tarkett North America, and Pauline Souza from WRNS Studio. Today's session, of course, is sponsored by Armstrong Ceiling and Wall Solutions and Tarkett. We're really thankful to the support of our partners for this program. Pauline, I'd like to bring you in here. Water is such a great lens for us to be thinking about, not just efficiency of use, as we've been talking, but, you know, as Roxanne brought in and Tana brought in as well, equity and resilience, right? And you've made these connections in a lot of your projects at WRNS Studio. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, how water can become a vehicle for us to think about those broader issues in sustainability around resilience and equity? Pauline, I think you're still on mute.
All right. Happy to. I think the panelists already have set up a great set of strategies that really tie to resiliency and equity. If you think about it, we are water, right? 70% of us is water, and that's about how much is in the world, although we can only use maybe 2%, 2.5% of it. And then if you think about that, you realize it's a very precious resource. And we have been seeing that our aquifers are getting depleted and saltwater intrusion is coming into a lot of our sites. And so it means that that availability of fresh water is not something that everyone can depend on. So I think I believe Tana and Kristen talked about this district-wide, bigger scale, understanding that what you do on your site has an effect on a greater community is a way to think about it in terms of resiliency and equity. A lot of the projects that we've been working on in the last few years have finally, I'm embarrassing to say that it's finally, we're recognizing that if you just stay within your footprint, you only do so much. If you think about gathering water from a greater site, or maybe even sharing across boundaries, there's a tough one, right, between clients and cities, then you can solve this issue that is about all of us collectively. So on a few projects, we've been able to take, like on a campus, water from the wider campus, help it kind of find its way through, which already has been piped. So if we're on the phase 2 of pipe it through some filtration, and then in one project up in Santa Rosa, take that off the building, the city impact, right? By having it flow through our systems, filtering it through, and then reusing it in landscape or bringing it back into the building. You do a couple of different things. That means we're not impacting the city down from us. Also thinking about how I think about it in terms of what I heard just now. Equity helps is connected to transparency. So if we think about making all of our systems visible, and we think about educating, right, increasing literacy around water. We all think that water is infinite, right? But it's not. It's the water we have now is the water we had hundreds, thousands of years. It just is what it is. But if you can increase the literacy, and I think especially young folks are very tuned in, and we can talk about the limits, but also talk about the great challenges and a way of thinking about place and landscape and regional issues. Then we start to build a better foundation to be able to talk about resiliency from so it's not just about building for that moment and for the people of that project. How do you build for a wider community? So I think for us, the most satisfying projects have been when we've taken a problem. We had a project up against a hill. When it rained, it would flood into the classrooms. And then instead of working against that flow, work with that flow and make the bioswales or the way water moves through that campus really visible to the 5th graders and the 6th graders. And that became, for me, almost more valuable because we were trying to say something through an everyday experience. So I think that a little bit of thinking about a community approach, which the other panelists already touched on, and then really educating the public and engaging the public is a way to help with that aspect of it. And I'm really thinking about the aquifer and other larger impacts to a site can start to engage the regulatory agencies. I agree with what everyone was saying. Sometimes it's a little bit of, I called it pass the buck, but I meant it in a positive way. You go to different agencies and they're like, yeah, that sounds good, but it's not mine. You have to go talk to them. You have to talk to them. We've even had projects permitted all the way through with a black water system when the local agency, when construction was starting, said, oh, well, we didn't know you meant that, even though the line diagram is in the project. So if anything, it is, as was said, a great opportunity for us to have thoughtful conversations with folks. And I will agree with what Kristen is saying. It takes a village. We were helped by folks like Sherwood Engineers and others in trying to really bring a holistic case to different parties.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Pauline. As you were talking, I I was kind of hearing also how water can be quite an emotive issue. When you talk about the kids being able to see water moving through their sight, that feels like such a moment of joy. But then at the same way, when you talk about um, regulators looking at black water systems and kind of cringing, that is also a moment of emotion around water. And I think it's really interesting that we don't have that range of emotional responses to carbon, for instance. And so water can be such a powerful force for good in sustainable design, and such a platform for conversations if we can learn to have them. As you were saying, how do we have those larger conversations? And Kenna actually kicked us off by saying that, and I think that's so important. We have quite a few. Yeah, go ahead, Pauline.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make a plug tied to literacy for the water reuse guide, and I'll put it in the chat. And I think part of that is just, I know that I didn't understand the different definitions of water, stormwater, rainwater, and sometimes having a little bit more of that understanding helps with conversations with the team and then the greater team, including regulatory agencies.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks so much, Pauline, for that. We have quite a few questions in from the audience already. Everyone, we are still taking questions, so please go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A window. If you go in there, you see a question you like, of course, vote it up, and we'll get to it first. We also have a couple of questions that I think Lisa would be able to weigh in on. So actually, Lisa, we'd love to bring you back on, if you don't mind, for just a few minutes. Samantha Johnson, and I think, Lisa, this is directly, I think, connected to your presentation as well. Samantha Johnson asks, are there any recommended resources for designing a rainwater harvesting system? Best practices, guidelines, anything like that?
Yeah, actually, I can put in the link, some links to the design guides that are being tracked by the ILFI. There's a whole series of resources that they have. The one that I shared was specific to the state of Oregon, but they've collected and have a resource. So I'll go ahead and add that to the chat. And it looks like Pauline has also added one as well in the chat. So thank you, Pauline.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any resources around rainwater harvesting in particular, Kristen, especially since you dealt with that recently? And then maybe Kenna, you want to come too?
Sure. I mean, we've got an international audience on here, which is fantastic. Rainwater harvesting is happening all over the globe. And we have these really fancy systems here in the United States that we put in the buildings. It doesn't have to be that complicated. We had a project where our client, a homeowner, was having their home renovated, and he has no connection to the building industry, not an engineer. He's a professor, but he really likes to research things. And he actually designed his own rainwater treatment system for his house based on internet research out of parts you could buy off the shelf at Home Depot for under $300. And he put it in front of the engineering team just to make sure it wouldn't kill him and his family. He wanted a professional to say, like, did I do this right? And they're like, yeah, that's great. Like, that's perfectly safe and healthy and wonderful. I know there's entire districts in India that now mandate rainwater harvesting for all of their buildings. I've seen things that run the gamut from like basically an inverted umbrella over a rain barrel. And as long as you understand the quality of the water going in it, what you're holding it in, and making sure you're treating it safely for what you're going to use it for, because not all water you collect you need to drink. So that's varying levels. That's all there is to it. So it can be dead simple, or it can be insanely complex, and everything in between. And obviously the cost changes based on where you fall in that spectrum. but to me, it's amazing. Like I saw a question in the chat that was about like, how do we deal with drought zones? How do you design for a climate zone that's always in drought or doesn't have all this free water from the sky? Pauline said it. We're 70% water. You have people coming into your buildings, leaving their water behind for you, right? They're carrying water from somewhere else in their bodies and depositing it in your bathrooms. That's a free resource if you choose to use it, and you can. There's plenty of technology out there to make that safe and healthy. You might run into regulatory issues, so maybe you can't use it for drinking water again, but you can use it for all of your other water uses to drastically drive down your demand. So you just have to think about water, like Pauline said, or for you Frozen 2 fans out there, water has memory. We're all using the same water molecules over and over. It's all one bucket. We have one bucket on this planet and we're all drawing out of it and putting it back in. So we need to let go of our kind of personal squeamishness about where the water's been and recognize that it's all the same water.
Tana, maybe even if you can respond also to the question about, a drought specific climate zone. So, arid zones or zones with less water, because I know you have a lot of experience dealing with that too.
Sure. I'll start with the question about rainwater harvesting. Lake Plato launched their R&D program. We're calling it Investigations about 3 or 4 years ago. One of our first projects we did was a cistern sizing tool that we put on our website, because I think more and more we all understand that transparency is key. And as firms start to develop tools to make it easier for people to research health of materials or carbon or anything, or water, we have to share those. We can't hold them to ourselves. We have to share the resources we have, because we're all in this together and we all want to do good. So that was a pretty simple tool that we had on our website. We had all the data for the cities in terms of rainfall. All you had to do was enter your location and enter an estimate for your water use, whether that's irrigation, toilet flushing, whatever. And it would look at a yearly chart and size a cistern for you. And people loved it. People used it. I say past tense used because the platform which that was created on, I think, no longer functions properly. So we need to do a new one. But for a while it was there. And before that, like Kristen said, there's websites and things that you could use in Texas and kind of, because Texas actually has been really a wonderful state for rainwater collection. And we had tools in the state where we could enter data and try and figure out how to do that too. But we decided to try and put a nationwide tool out there. And as for the challenges in states in the Southwest where water's a little more the rain doesn't come as often, I can't lie to you and say it's easy. The problem is you have monsoon seasons, right? You get a lot of rain in July and August, and then you get sporadic rain throughout the year, maybe only totaling 9 inches a year. So in order to collect that water in July and August long enough to actually expand through the year for use, it's really challenging. It's a huge collection system, but that's kind of one of the things. And also using condensation is one too that I hear about used on lots of projects. Christy Tonight did a great project at University of Arizona where a lot of rainwater collection was used. Condensate was used for irrigation and things. We're doing a project in Phoenix now, but actually the engineers on that project are telling me that in these dry climates, it's challenging. It's not a lot of condensate that you're getting. So I've heard different things, but that's one opportunity that you can use in these hot climates where you are using a lot of air conditioners. See if you can use the condensate water as well. That's about as much as I have to add to that, but others might chime in on thoughts there for these climates.
I'll just add that we're doing some work in Utah, which is a desert. And while we thought that we could try to collect water, as you were saying, Tana, it's really difficult. We were bumping up against regulatory issues because the thought is that all water that hits the ground is the water of the whole for Salt Lake City, all of Salt Lake City. So thinking, and yet they're bumping up against. There's times when I think we've seen in the newspaper where it said, "Please, residents, don't use your water," which is, how do you do that? But to think about how to then design so that you can live a little differently within your means. And what does that mean for us, like in the States? I think there's 50 gallons per person as a target. Lisa will correct me if I'm wrong. But so often we know that the rest of the world uses even less. So is our target really needing to be reshaped? And to what Kristen was saying, do we need to think a little differently about what our resource is? Do we need that lawn really for that campus? So.
We have a question here that's addressed to Lisa, but I think we can just talk about this in general. Enrique Mondragon asks, Lisa, we're developing self-efficient homes, and one of our most important topics is obtaining water through condensation, rainwater harvesting, the use of green, gray, and even black water. Are there any benefits today in the US for self-efficient homes which are water independent? So I know your early research way back when was all about water independence. So do you want to talk about sort of where the state of that is today, and how we can see a mainstreaming of it in in home building?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I guess I'd break it into two parts. The first part about more looking at what are the benefits in terms of from a financial perspective, and then what are the benefits from a societal perspective. And of course, from a financial perspective, it so much varies depending on where you live. I can tell you that the $500 that I was quoting for 2008 as an annual water usage, right now in Portland, Oregon, we've tripled. And so we're now looking at $1,500 a year annually for what an average home would spend. So you start to think about the systems that you could incorporate in your own home and what those costs could be. The payback period is really coming down. But then there's the societal benefit. And I think we can't walk away from that in any means, even without the financial benefit. And as was previously mentioned by the panelists, there's a lot of people who don't have adequate water resources, and water is getting scarcer due to climate change in certain areas. And so thinking about our individual water budget, I can tell every person on this Zoom, I'm going to challenge you, take a look at yourself for a week. Write down every time that you use the sink, every time you use the toilet, when you turn on the faucet to water the garden or water the lawn, make an estimate of how much water you use and compare that to the 50 gallons that Pauline had mentioned. That is the American. It's actually a low figure for America. I've actually heard 70 to 80 as more average for America. See how you do. I ask my students to do this, and it's amazing how eye-opening it is about where you're using water.
That's incredible. Does anybody else want to come in on this idea of water independent projects and how we can make the case for them? We'd love to hear from all of you. And then Roxanne, I think if you can just talk a little bit about some of those programs that you're running to encourage people to save water as well. Because I think we have to use every tool in the box as far as trying to bring down water usage. Clearly 80 gallons is a ridiculous figure. I come from India where anyway, enough said. So I think let's just, if anybody else has comments on that in terms of water self-sufficiency, water independence, I'd love to hear, as well as what creative strategies we might find to encourage people towards better behavior. And especially target with that kind of hand printing sort of philosophy as well.
Sure. I would say when we look at manufacturing, and we're manufacturing flooring material that does require water, we're cooling products down with water. But before we really started looking at using closed loop water systems, we were just expending water that maybe floated over a piece of flooring material to cool it so it wasn't dirty water. So now that we use this closed loop, we're using continuously looping around so that we're not just dispersing water in a wasteful manner. And it really takes looking at each step of your process, at least for a manufacturer. And even like Lisa said at home, what you're doing each part of your day. But as we walk through our facility and really look at each step of what we do, it makes a difference. We follow world-class manufacturing techniques, and we're constantly evaluating each and every step. And we encourage the people who are actually doing the work on the production lines to give us suggestions. They're the ones that see where waste is happening the quickest. They see where we have processes that are duplicated. And we'll work with them. They'll help us set up a program really to change how we're doing things. And I think that's really important. And it's not just because we had a great success at our Dalton, Georgia facility, doesn't mean now we stop. It means we still have to continue. It means we are able to accomplish that. What else can we do to really decrease the water usage we have, and continuing looking at our materials and assessing our materials to make sure we're not contaminating water as well. And I think that's just as important. You know, we're reducing our energy as well, but as you said, water is just as critical. And in some states here in the US, it's even more critical than energy usage because they are really suffering without the water.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing up contamination, you know, because I think in regular building use, I mean, that's not something that architects and designers necessarily consider, but in manufacturing, of course, it's a big consideration. And, you know, those manufactured products then go into buildings. So part of the transparency, you know, that we've been talking about transparency, but part of that transparency is also to understand, you know, what are some of those negative impacts on water systems throughout the life cycle of a building, beginning from, you know, the manufacture of building products as well. So thanks so much for that. I'm gonna go ahead, Kristen.
Because I think there's a really important thing that gets missed in a lot of these conversations in our industry. We focus on water quantity, but we haven't really looked at water quality until recently. And that's where like the well rating system and Fitwell version 2 now, I think, are starting to draw our focus to that, which is long overdue. The Flint, Michigan water crisis is kind of the thing we all know of, but we don't think it's happening in our neighborhood, right? We're like, oh, that's Flint's problem. When you start to actually look at public water infrastructure in the United States, this is in the United States, we are exceeding contaminant levels in almost every city. And it depends what contaminant it is, but I'd say there's very few instances where our public infrastructure water is as pure as we think it is. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. However, balance that with the fact that when you push for water independence at the individual building scale, you're basically requiring every building operator to become a water safety technician. That's not their skill set, right? And so like every one of these living building projects kind of has to have a building manager who is essentially running their own water treatment plant within the building. You can't do that at the scale of an individual single family home. You can, but it's probably not a good idea, right? You know, we're all like armchair epidemiologists right now with COVID, but that's probably not a good idea either. Like there's a reason expertise exists in certain locales. So there's always that balance of, we certainly want to reduce the amount of water we're using where we don't need it. So we want to use water in the right places. We need to keep drinking a lot of water. We need water to be healthy. So we don't want to reduce our water intake. But maybe we don't need to be using so much water in our toilets, especially drinkable water in our toilets, which is just insanity. So the balance between how do you make sure the water is safe? It's actually easier to do that at scale. It's easier to do that with a centralized water treatment plant because you have the expertise, you have the funds, you have the people to make sure that water is as safe as it can be. You can't do it at the scale of each individual building as successfully. So there's a trade-off there. And then you blow up that trade-off into the energy it takes to run these systems. So each individual system takes more energy than just pulling the water from the centralized plant. And every one of those, every pipe, every, you know, tank that you're putting in, that's the embodied carbon footprint of manufacturing an additional product, an additional tank, additional piping, additional everything. So there is a cost to doing that. There's no silver bullets in sustainability. There's no one solution that's absolutely perfect. So that's what we're always trying to balance is do it where it's right and makes sense, but still recognize that maybe doing it at scale is more appropriate solution. And that's why I think, ILFI has done a great job with the Living Building Challenge of recognizing when a scalar solution would be more appropriate and allowing for that it doesn't all have to happen within your private ownership building footprint.
Yeah, I was going to add on that I think it's a good point, Kristen, because the water quality issue gets sort of swept under the rug. And I know that when we were starting our well building work, the first precondition is to have it tested. And it makes everybody really nervous. And you think, well, if we have good water, why are we so nervous, right? But even I was like, oh gosh, we're going to fail. When I should have been like, oh gosh, these poor people have lousy water. So I think it's part of this, deeper finally, at least for me, because I've been practicing so long and it's just like, aha, now at the end of my career. But so just to get increased literacy, and I think the AIA Design Excellence Framework is trying to be a place where it at least prompts for practitioners, right? Prompts with questions, because I think we've forgotten what we were supposed to ask. And this is all part of leading to more resiliency, more equity, more transparency.
I think
Tana,
that
do you have any?
contamination is important. As we look at that, I live in Massachusetts, we have a lot of older housing, and the concern is always lead paint. But are we asking about the old piping and the contamination from that? And that's not discussed. So I think that's a kind of a missed mark, I think, a lot of times when we're in and looking at rehabbing facilities.
Yeah. I mean, all our infrastructure is aging. I mean, in New York, there's so many buildings that are still getting their water from overhead cisterns that haven't been cleaned in I don't know how many decades. Tana, I'd love to bring you in on is there a connection between what we're talking about on water quality and the eco-conservation work that your studio does? I'd just love to touch on that just for a second, and then we'll get back to questions from the attendees.
Sure. So I'm one of the leaders of our eco-conservation studio at Lake Flato. We focus on land-based projects, and lots of our clients are nonprofits, our botanical gardens, nature centers, education centers, and things like that. And the water quality piece is not something that a lot of our projects have focused on yet. I think it's a really, with WELL and some of these other programs, it is becoming more in focus, which is incredible. But one of the things I'd like to touch on in regards to that, specific to our studio, is something that was mentioned earlier, how the water story is really more tangible to people and then say a carbon story, an energy story, and can be beautiful. The biophilic nature of water, or the human connection to water is quite strong. And so really telling that story in an intriguing way, and in so doing, changing behavior, and also really boosting the mission or promoting the mission of the nonprofits and our clients is something really positive about focusing on water in our projects. It's really a wonderful story for us to tell. It's a wonderful story for Metropolis to tell. People love to tell the water story on projects. So that's a positive aspect of these projects that have this focus on water. The Living Building project I've done is for the Dixon Water Foundation, and they do stormwater, watershed protection through the restoration of our tallgrass prairies throughout the sort of Texas and mid-US. And they didn't come to us asking for a living building, but when they found out what a living building was, and specifically the water story, they were really intrigued because it supported their mission. It strengthened it. The constructed wetland became an illustration of how the prairie and protects the watershed, even though it's a different story. It's not the same plants, but this idea of what we can do naturally to protect our water systems, and the fact that septic systems, which is what they would have used in rural Texas, cause more groundwater pollution than anything in some parts of the world, depending on the soils. So even though it added cost to their project, even though essentially they had to hire a building manager because the constructed wetland systems was pretty complicated, lots of pumps, lots of alarms going off when there's a big rainstorm, and it needs to control the system. So and because they needed to look at and understand the water quality. So as Kristen was saying, it's like your own little water system there on a building, which isn't necessarily always the way to go. But it really was a way, and becoming a living building was a way to really raise awareness of what the Dixon Water Foundation is doing. And water is a wonderful way to tell that story.
Right, exactly. And I think that connects to what Pauline was saying about, reframing the question, right, around water. So it's not so much about, have I succeeded with this water goal of mine, but rather, what is it doing for the people who are living and working on this project, right? And really reframing it in terms of human impact. And that's what will give us that story that you're talking about, Tana. And I think that's a really important insight. We're here talking about working with water with Tana Florian from Lake Plato, Roxanne Spears from Tarquette, Pauline Souza from WRNS Studio, and Kristen Dotson from the Miller-Harrell Partnership, and Lisa Pedersen from SRG Partnership as well. Thank you all so much. We're going to be taking a few questions now in pretty rapid sweep. So let's try and get through these as much as possible. Lisa, this might be a question for you. Victor Names asks, can you give us some idea of how much water retention and treatment adds to the cost of construction and how much it reduces the water bill over time? Are there some quick back of the napkin calculations on that or estimates?
Yeah, I have to say I don't have up to date, but we were able to achieve in 2008, when we were last looking at this, 2009, about a reduction in the cost increase was about a 10% overall increase in the cost of the plumbing systems. But the payback is really where you see it. Now, I think that Kristen brought up an important point of needing to have potentially regulators or someone on site, and you need to make sure you count for the person or people that are going to be keeping the system going in your overall calculation. And so it's going to vary so much depending on where your jurisdiction is and what your true cost of water is.
Right. Just after this session, we're actually going to have Chris Pike from ARC, the Building Performance Analysis Platform from USGBC, come on. Maybe somebody should ask him about how ARC tracks water use.
There you go.
Because you don't need a person to do everything. We have sensors nowadays. Kristen, Ian Solenberger asks, for the project in Atlanta, did you design a thermal recovery system for the HVAC, or was it something else?
Okay, so good question. It's a little complicated. So water is the distribution medium in the system. So it's in the radiant, and then for the airside system in the auditorium, but it's closed loop, so there's no water gained or lost. Then it actually does tap into the campus chilled water system that supplies the building, but that's also closed loop, nothing gained or lost. And then the campus chilled water plant is used in the cooling tower. So the water is actually lost out of a cooling tower, as it always is. But that's where it becomes part of the water balance, where additional stormwater captured on the roof is offset in the project. So it offsets that cooling tower loss with infiltration back into the landscape. I hope that answers it.
Yeah. Pauline, maybe this one is for you. Michael Skelly asks, how can water in low-income developments improve food security and access to healthy food? So, how can we think about water as part of, food security, maybe in affordable housing or low-income projects?
I'll start with maybe some experience we had with a project in Watsonville, which is really a recycling center, which got put in place because it's primarily an agriculture community. A lot of fruits and vegetables that we enjoy around the country come from this part of California. So it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It also is supporting the families in Watsonville. And what they were finding out is the draw from the aquifer was starting to it was, the result was saltwater intrusion from the Pacific Ocean, and they were tracking it year by year. So part of the effort to put this recycling center in place was to recycle the water that came from the businesses in Watsonville, but also to make sure that the agriculture business held, the communities, the neighborhoods, and all the people who are part of this held, because the saltwater intrusion tracking was pretty significant year by year. I can't remember the feet, but it was in feet. It wasn't in like inches. So I think that that was an experience we had that kind of what encompassed much more than just the little project we had. And I think maybe to what Kristen was talking about, in some of the urban projects we have with housing and affordable housing, there is this balance between with the amount of use, and at least back then, now we're all working and living at home, but back then, what was the balance so that we could cycle the water? I agree, you know, with what everyone said. Kristen was saying it's ridiculous that we're flushing with potable, because why would we need to? I think what we've are starting to play around with just through our programming, and I'm sure everyone on this panel is doing the same, is figuring out what's the synergy between workplace, if we go back to that old paradigm, and housing, so that the use is 24/7. You know, in schools, they're only there for a certain amount of time and not in summer. So you can't make financial sense of some of these circular systems. But if we matched in urban areas or any area, housing with workplace, maybe there's a nice synergy that can help us out holistically. I'm not sure that answered, Avi, what you were asking, but
no, that's great. Of course, when somebody asks about, you know, low income areas and food security, I'm thinking urban, but I'm so glad you brought in agricultural communities, because I think part of it is we need to stop thinking just about, you know, urban scenarios as we're designing for sustainability. And I think that's such a great example, because what we do in urban areas, of course, has an effect on aquifers, has an effect on water tables, has an effect on what water is available for agriculture, and affects food security at a large scale, not just, you know, specific to the community. So I think that's great. And then I think the point about, you know, leveraging, you know, use across different building types is absolutely fantastic as well. Speaking of systems thinking, our next question is that the systems rethinking is great. Do you think we also need to radically rethink typology? So reinventing stilt, pilatus buildings, floating buildings, etc., to deal with the huge flood issue, sea level rise to come. I don't know, Tana, if you want to talk about that, because, you know, I know you're not in a sea level rise kind of situation with some of your projects, but, you know, certainly you're thinking about, you know, water levels.
Yeah, we've done some projects, some coastal projects, where we're definitely thinking about sea level rise, the site analysis, and looking at the most resilient building and how to build that, knowing that there may be a hurricane or something coming through, looking at the health of the building materials we use. So if they end up back in the ocean, they're not polluting the ocean, has been critical to our process. We haven't done any floating buildings yet, but I love the idea of it. I know there was a lot of that in the competition work done around in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. But I don't know if any of those projects, I don't know if any of y'all know if any of those projects were built. Those are sort of big ideas, but I don't know if they're built. So right now our focus when it comes to coastal work is really resiliency, looking at whether it's electrical placement and you know, material placement, how easily it is to renovate a building after a storm, and of course just building a resilient building that doesn't allow storms to impact the building, and putting the building in smart places, higher land, and looking at sea level rise. And sometimes in the Southeast it's hard to say those three words, sea level rise, words, right? And so yeah, you have to be really careful about how you talk about it. But it's something that everyone has acknowledged to some degree, and it's become an important part of our projects, and it's really a differentiator because we've been so focused on it in the Southeast, and other firms haven't. So I encourage everyone to really strengthen their credentials when it comes to resilient building and some of the certification programs we have around that.
Yeah, absolutely. In Metropolis, really quickly, we've definitely reported on floodable parks in Rotterdam, for instance. New York City is undergoing a resiliency measure where we're looking at sort of porous water systems, especially downtown in the financial district at the tip of Manhattan Island, for those of you who don't live here. Also, you know, we looked at Miami, you know, studies that are being done in Miami, where most firms are now advising building beyond code. So, you know, code only specifies rising a building, you know, up to a certain level, but it doesn't even account for like the 100-year flood. So, you know, people are looking at how they can exceed code in Miami to account for, you know, inevitable sea level rise. It's not something you can say easily in Miami either. I think the next question might be a little tough for our panelists, but certainly, Ellie, we'll look into it and see if we can actually get you a percentage of buildings that are certified with LEED, ILFI, WELL, and Fitwel. Thankfully, it's a growing number. And there's a lot more projects that are undergoing certification, I know, for all of those certifications. So we'll certainly return to that. An interesting question from one of our attendees: do any of you look to indigenous or vernacular water management methods to be rethought in terms of today, as opposed to resilience on high tech? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I think the
Lisa,
only thing
were
I
you
might be, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead,
Colleen.
Oh, sorry. The only thing I was going to offer is I think that we look, this may not be the absolute answer. We look at the historic hydrology of the site, and I think that this whole group does too, to understand what it could be, and that has in a lot of our projects informed how to think about it versus just drought tolerant, right, and regional. So if we kind of go back to what should that site be able to handle, what was on that site, that has helped us think about what, not to go all the way back, but just to be thoughtful about place, a moment in time. Lisa?
Yeah, I was actually going to mention Bermuda, which is an interesting place because all of the roofs in Bermuda are the same white material, and they're like a ziggurat type shape, and so the water runs down, and the material is actually purifying the water, and then they collect it. And if you think about an island like Bermuda is even more challenged in terms of being able to, you know, live within their water budget. And so some of the ideas that we've been incorporating in projects are how could we use the roof to clean the water in a similar way as what they do in, you know, just traditional Bermudan architecture.
Right. You know, I just want to remind everyone who's listening in about 10 minutes, we're going to be showcasing a demonstration of ARC, which is a building performance analysis platform from the USGBC, and is really, I think, an increasingly important tool to understanding the performance of sustainable buildings today. So please stick around with us for that. We're going to take a few more questions now from our attendees. Kent Pearley asks, can any of the panelists speak to the issue of water rights law and how that can be changed in today's world? So zooming out real big, you know, does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was interesting, and I'll kind of address the water code map as well question that's in the chat. So right now, the link that I put in the chat on the ILFI's website specifically provides a guide that allows you to make a water map very similar to the water map that I shared. And it kind of points out the jurisdictional different questions and who you might want to pull in. And it also shows some of the water maps that have been created. The reason that this links to your other question is states or provinces that have water rights, that starts at the very top. Oregon is not a water rights state, so we didn't first have to prove that we as individual buildings had the right to have our water. But when we started to look at it in Colorado, for example, Colorado is a water rights state. And that makes a huge, huge difference. And I didn't focus on it on the last map, but if you notice, Colorado, for a southwestern state, it's one of the few that are not having any regulations. And that starts because of that strong water rights. So I'm very interested in this person's question about how do you tackle water rights, because ultimately that's where we need to go. So the answer is we don't have one for Canada yet, but there have been numerous. California has one, Texas has one, and then there's also cities that individually have one. But check out the link on terms of how, because we'd love to have a map for Canada. And it probably will be province by province, I'm guessing.
Right. I'm going to connect up two questions here. One attendee asks, how can new water systems be installed in older buildings? What are the financial benefits and the space required for that? And then Mauricio Sobrino asks, how much water management effort is needed when we talk about renovation and adaptive reuse? Just for context, we had a big conversation around renovation and adaptive reuse on yesterday's panel. So can we talk about updating water infrastructure and what effort that takes? Would anyone like to jump in on that?
I guess I'll start. Yeah,
Kristen? Yeah, go ahead.
it's not easy.
It's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, because you're opening up walls, you're having to rerun piping. And with any of these systems, pretty much anytime you want to stray from the norm, which the norm is potable water comes from the central utility, the municipal utility plant, gets piped to your building, goes to all your fixtures, gets collected in a combined sewer, and goes to the sewer. That's the standard system in the United States. So anytime you're trying to do something different, you're almost always going to be doubling up piping because they want you to still connect to that structure for resilience and for safety. It's like a backup scenario. So getting back to the cost issue, that all of course adds cost because you can't essentially remove the old system entirely. Most organizations, most governments won't let you do that entirely for safety. They want that sort of backup plan with the water. So when you're trying to do it in an existing building, it's just going to go case by case, right? Like if you're building based on what the distribution system is, it might be really easy. Like if for some reason all your toilets are on a stack on one pipe, it's going to be super easy to grab rainwater and just pipe it to those toilets, call it done. But if it's one pipe going in the building that then filters everything else down, which is a lot of spaces, good luck. You're going to be opening up walls and running additional piping. Or you can invest in really more aggressive technologies like membrane bioreactors or things that actually can take black water and turn it essentially into potable water again, because you need an end use solution for all the water. You can't you got to use a hammer instead of a scalpel in that situation. And with the hammer comes cost and membrane bioreactors use a lot of energy too. So the energy penalty there, but every project's different. Every project in every city in every location was built differently. We think buildings are all the same nowadays, but code has changed a million times over. And I can't even tell you, if you're a homeowner, this, every person that owned that home before you did something to that house and didn't permit it. God knows what they did, but you won't find out till you open up the walls. So it could be great. It could be easy peasy, or it could be an absolute nightmare, or anywhere in between. And you just don't know. Unless you get some as-built or you start opening up that wall.
Yeah. Lisa, you were going to come in.
Yeah.
I just want to say before you come in, Lisa, that this is probably going to be our last comment on this panel. We'll let Lisa come in, and then we'll probably have to transition over to Chris, but I hope all of you will stick around with us. And everybody who's listening, please stay. Coming up is a demonstration of ARC, a really fantastic, I think, tool from USGBC. Lisa, go ahead.
I guess I was going to close, with a plug. Can you make your new buildings, and all of you designers and architects, can you make a net zero water ready building? Because Kristen's point is really absolutely apropos. When you're building the building is the best time to be able to add that secondary set of plumbing pipes that we know are going to be required from a jurisdictional, just like we make net zero energy ready buildings by including conduit from the roof. Think about and advocate on your projects about making a net zero water ready building. You don't have to get all of the things, but the things that are behind the wall, those pipes, that's what is going to be low cost to put in at the beginning. And I know many jurisdictions in California are actually requiring now that you do that. You have a gray water ready facility. Just
Wonderful.
a plug.
Well, absolutely. And I think a really important one, even if we're not able to achieve, full water independence today, we can at least lay the ground for people to do it, for the people who come after us to do it. And I think that's really important too. I think we have to stop thinking about just writ large architecture projects as ending, the day, on move-in day or whatever it is that you want to call it. We have to think of them as legacy now, because what we build today is probably something that's going to have to last for a few hundred years. We're not going to be able to build a whole lot more going forward. And so, that long-term outlook towards architecture and design is something that's absolutely essential today. So it's a great note for us to end on.